Mixing with Mike mixing tip, creating dynamic contrast in a mix. One of probably the biggest secrets in terms of mixing and making great sounds and making great mixes is creating contrast. Contrast comes in many subtle forms throughout the course of a mix. So one of the things that people, when they're attaching themselves to tips and tricks and things like that in terms of the mixing process, or they love the way a snare plate sounds, so that you always use a plate reverb on a snare, that type of thing. There are reasons why some of these things work and why some of these things don't work. One of the biggest problems that people have is the too much of the same thing. Like, oh, this is really amazing. Let me put it on everything and it'll make everything amazing. And what ends up happening is exactly the opposite. Because when you apply the same thing on everything, then you lose that level of contrast. You lose that sense of perception. So much of this has to do with the way that we perceive our environments, the programming that's already in our brain. The real secret to mixing is really understanding what that is, what that programming is, and understanding how to use the way that the brain processes audio and actually all our senses, the way it processes video and everything else, or what we see rather, and then putting that into the work that you do. So like with every decision you make, there are multiple layers or levels of a decision. Like putting a plate reverb, for example, on a snare can be a great thing or it can be a horrible thing. If you use a plate reverb on all the keyboards and you use a plate reverb on the vocals and you use it on everything else, then it becomes not so good of a thing because everything has that same thing on it. And so as a result, when you're going through a mix, what you're trying to do in every little way that you can is create a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a contrast. So, for example, I can take certain things here in a mix. So let's see if I can just kind of grab onto a couple of things here and then talk about like where it comes from. So here's a violin part, and it's really just a sustained high part. And what I want you to listen for is notice the way that it images, how it appears in the speakers. Now, in this mix, this keyboard achieves a certain effect, and that what I wanted it to really do is to raise the energy up in the speakers. So in and of itself, the keyboard part, okay, it sounds, okay, there you hear the high end, the presence of it, you hear the reverb of it. But really, when you listen to it, it's kind of flat. You don't get the sense of depth. And the reason why you don't really get the sense of depth, a little bit from the reverb, is because there's nothing that it is up against which gives you the sense of where it's at. So now if I take this, for example, and I also have a couple of pads that are kind of sitting underneath here, and now we contrast with what's going on there. Notice the difference in depth perception. Right, very flat and up front. Now all of a sudden it becomes three-dimensional and more distant. So that's a really, really, really important thing, just this small example. So why does that happen? And how can we play with this or manipulate this and work with this in a mix? It comes in so many decisions. It comes in everything from the subtractive EQ that we use. So for example, what we have is a house mix. And so one of the primary things about this that's going to drive it is to get the low end to really drive well. And so primarily what ends up happening is the low end is driven from the kick and the bass energy. So if you listen to a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the kick and the bass. So what do you notice about the rest of the mix? Right, there's not a lot of low frequency energy. Somewhat exaggerated, like you can hear the effect of that low end energy being filtered. So why am I doing that? Because in order to make that bass sit really low in the speaker, if too many other sounds carry that low frequency energy, it'll pull it right up into the middle of the speakers. And it doesn't mean that I can't have things like explosions or other types of effects and things that go on that have low end. However, what I'll end up doing with them is something different. So, for example, if I have that bass and it's more or less kind of centered and the kick drum is kind of centered and I have that and I have some other environmental energy, like there's a bit of low end that comes from these pads, that I filtered off. And I could kind of keep some of that in if I spread it wider or move it outside. But more likely than not, what ends up happening is it ends up filling out with the bass. So why would we have this? And why not, what about when the bass and the kick drum are not playing? Then what happens to the arrangement? And this is something that actually is really cool, because when you get down to a break section, like when we come to a section here where this breaks down, and I'll just kind of lead you right into where the vocals occur, when that low end energy sort of drops out and the arrangement and your focus switches to the vocals, and now all of a sudden you don't have that kind of low end stuff going on, it's like your energy, you're kind of shifting away from it. You're shifting away from that focus of the of that low end energy for that short period of time. So when it re-enters, it comes in more powerfully. So check this out. So, silly me, I kind of forgot that the bass actually still plays through that section, but you still feel that difference or that shift, with the low end of the kick drum as it kind of drives through there. And if I wanted to, I could do something like put in a filter over that section, or just even, edit and mute out that particular part. So when it comes... I guessed with the edit there, a little bit zoomed out, but you get the basic idea. And so these are the things, these contrast elements that help to shape things. So different things here, for example, there's so many examples here of stuff like this that you can kind of work with, working with different hi-hat parts. I have a couple of clap parts here where one is primarily dealing with the low clap energy and the other is dealing with the high clap energy, and kind of getting them to kind of coordinate together. So I may process them different, put a little bit more reverb on one if I want it more high-endy on the reverb side or low end on the reverb side, working with the kind of power of it and creating things. So like even on effects, if I have a certain effect, like for example here on the claps, I have a plate. Nothing special, right? I actually, what I have here is just a plate, just like on an R-verb. So it's not necessarily like an EMT plate or something that might be warm. And it achieves a certain effect, which is exactly what I want. I want the sustain of that clap to kind of linger out. And you'll notice that the decay drops like very carefully into the next hit, but doesn't overlap too much. So I'm very careful to kind of lay that so there's not a lingering over. But if I now put something, and let's just see here, I can't remember exactly what I put on the vocals. let's see. Okay, so I have an H reverb on the vocals. So I was trying to see if I had like a plate. Like sometimes I'll put a plate reverb on the vocal, but there's no other plate really here used on any other thing in the song. I could put it on the vocal with pre-delay and get a different tone. And then if I used an EMT, I would have the plate characteristic, but something that would be for an instrument that may be far more important. So as I go through and I set up reverbs and I do different things, like for example, I have an old school like RMS non-lin that's used on the percussion instruments to create a certain stage for the percussion instruments, and I don't use this sound on anything else. And what it does is it creates a unique stage that the other instruments like the keyboards and things can kind of play off of. So it's these sort of very subtle forms of contrast, layering over and over again and doing in different things with EQ contrasts when parts play at the same time. Compression contrasts. One could be fast attack, the other could be slow attack. The slow attack one could be fast release, which means it kind of pulls more forward. The other one with a fast attack and a long release stages it a little bit back. And that contrast allows the two instruments to kind of work very much together. Now, there is also some glue elements. Like you'll notice here that every channel here has an SSL G channel. So this is just a Waves SSL G channel. This is sort of the glue for the song. And that when I put this on every channel, what I'm doing is I'm creating a sort of sonic signature. Sort of think of it like a canvas from which the rest of the song builds. And so even if I only use a little bit, maybe I use this quite often just for the compression to kind of stage whether fast attack, slow attack, set the release time to some musical value so I can create some pumping movement in an aggressive kind of way that really befits the SSL console. Do some basic equalization, which has a really, really wicked kind of tonal character to it. And then I can build and add other elements, like I can put more of a Neve EQ on certain things where I want like a warmer, different kind of tone to it. But I create like a palette from which, or a canvas from which, as I start to put other elements in the mix, I can feel the contrast of those things and feel that depth. And so as I kind of work through the mix, all of these different elements, when they come in, they all have their place that contrast some of the other things, so I don't have to push volume or push frequency, especially high end, in order to make everything kind of fit together. So a lot of filtering, particularly in this mix, because there's a lot of elements that kind of go on here. But let's listen to a little bit, and maybe I'll kind of point out some of the things that I'm talking about along the way. From the beginning. So that one guitar has that sweeping kind of filter effect that no other, or that, not the guitar, like that keyboard, that no other thing has in the song. And so just for example, when that effect with the high-end reverb kicks in, and you hear that kind of kick in with that long sustained real reverb, it's all very filtered up very high. So what ends up happening is when you hit that event, it becomes this thing that's almost like this flat plane of clouds that rides over the top of the mix. And if I bring it too low, then it starts to mess with all of the other reverbs that are going on. So I filter it out of the way, contrast it so that it sits over the top and serves its purpose, and it can be really, really long without interfering with a single thing in the mix. And it's all of these kind of subtle things, a unique effect on that one keyboard. I think, I can't remember what it was like a phaser or a flanger, or it might have been a pedal like a wah effect. And then all of these things having their little unique characters. Now, every song is a little bit different. and the approach will be subtly different. For this particular type of track, it can be more extreme with the individual sounds so they have more character and also draw more interest, so that there's more ear candy, so to speak, and the separation of things. So you hear like the individuality of the uniqueness of the instruments. These are the types of things that you make on so many subtle decisions throughout all the course. But it's something that you have to consider. When you say you want to put a reverb on something, think about what type of reverb you're using on other things and how you can make a different choice in that particular reverb. When you're deciding on an EQ or trying to set an EQ or reamping something, it's like, how can you do something there that actually is compatible with other things or contrasts other things that are going on in the mix without kind of tearing them down, without kind of overwhelming them. And when you create those contrasts, what you'll find is that you'll have mixes that have all the warmth and body and depth and openness and everything that you want without making them interfere, without having to push like high frequencies that kind of make them so that you can hear them, but it makes your mixes sound really annoying. This is sort of a little bit of a scattered tip because there's so many ideas, and this in and of itself, just this one concept of contrast, can be a whole individual course for all the individual types of things: EQ, compression, and because you get into all those different things, effects, reverbs, and levels, pan positions, pan movement, filters, and all of those types of things. That's why what makes electronic music so cool, because there's so much of that's in there that's just sort of built into the natural sounds, and you can have a lot of fun kind of playing with things. Same ideas, though, work with every kind of mix and every style of music. It's just adapting them to what those are. Anyway, hopefully there's some helpful advice here in this Mixing with Mike mixing tip, creating dynamic contrast in a mix.